power. For centuries, it has drawn people to the highest offices in the land, and nowhere in America is power more concentrated than in the White House. Presidents are remembered for their victories, their speeches, and their legacies. But behind the speeches and portraits, the White House has also been a stage for scandal, passion, betrayal, and twisted love affairs that history often prefers to whisper about rather than shout aloud. To understand the true human cost of leadership and the darker truths of those who wielded it, we must step into the shadows of America's most famous residents and expose the love stories that broke every boundary of morality, politics, and power. The story begins long before the White House was even finished. Thomas Jefferson, the nation's third president and author of the Declaration of Independence, was a man praised for his intellect and eloquence. Yet, his private life tells a story of power imbalance and exploitation that is hard to reconcile with the ideals of freedom he preached. Jefferson's long and controversial relationship with Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman at Monticello, remains one of America's most troubling contradictions. Hemings was only a teenager when the much older Jefferson began a relationship with her, a relationship she could never freely consent to as a woman in bondage. Over the course of decades, she bore him several children, and while some descendants later lived as free people and blended into white society, the roots of their existence reveal the hypocrisy of a founding father who declared all men equal while maintaining ownership of the woman he slept beside. Jefferson's affair wasn't love in the traditional sense. It was about power, control, and silence. It reminds us that the very foundations of America were built on contradictions too glaring to ignore. But Jefferson was far from the only president whose passions became entangled with scandal. Andrew Jackson, the fiery general who would later rise to the presidency, fell in love with a woman named Rachel Donaldson Roberts. Their romance was marked by controversy from the very beginning. Rachel was already married when she met Jackson, and though she believed her first marriage had ended, it turned out that her divorce was not finalized when she wed Jackson. This meant that, by law, Andrew Jackson was living with another man's wife. Their relationship became a scandal that political rivals used to shred Jackson's reputation, calling Rachel an adulteress and mocking her relentlessly. Jackson loved fiercely and defended Rachel's honor with equal ferocity, even fighting duels over her name. But the relentless attacks broke her spirit. By the time Jackson finally ascended to the White House, Rachel had died, many say from the stress of the public shaming. Jackson blamed his political enemies for her death, carrying a bitterness that never left him. It was a love story marred by tragedy, where affection was real, but the consequences of scandal proved fatal. The White House walls, if they could speak, would tell of other liaisons just as secretive and controversial. In the mid-19th century, James Buchanan, America's only bachelor president, was whispered to have shared more than just friendship with William Rufus King, a senator from Alabama. Their relationship was so close that Washington insiders jokingly referred to King as Mrs. Buchanan. Letters between the two men, filled with affection and intimacy, suggest a bond far deeper than mere political alliance. In a time when homosexuality was considered a crime and a moral failing, the suggestion that a president might have loved another man was scandalous beyond measure. While the truth of their relationship will never be fully known, the rumors have endured for more than 150 years, showing that love, whether hidden or forbidden, has always found its way into the White House, even when the world outside refused to accept it. And then there was Abraham Lincoln. History books immortalize him as the savior of the Union, the president who ended slavery, the great emancipator. But Lincoln's personal life was far more complex than the tidy stories of textbooks. His marriage to Mary Todd Lincoln was passionate, stormy, and often tragic. Mary was intelligent and ambitious, but she struggled with mental illness, mood swings, and grief after losing several of their children. Their love was filled with devotion, but also arguments that spilled into public view, shocking Washington society. More controversially, Whispers about Lincoln's close relationships with men like Joshua Speed have led some historians to question whether the president might have shared romantic bonds outside his marriage. Letters reveal a deep intimacy, and the two men even shared a bed for years when they were young. Whether or not it was romantic, it was a connection that spoke to the loneliness Lincoln often carried. In the White House, surrounded by war, grief, and political pressure, Lincoln's private struggles showed how even the greatest leaders grapple with love, loss, and human weakness. By the late 19th century, presidential scandals shifted from whispers in letters to front-page news. Grover Cleveland, who would later serve 2 non-consecutive terms, found himself at the center of one of the ugliest sex scandals in presidential history. As a young lawyer in Buffalo, he had an affair with a woman named Maria Halpin, who later accused him of fathering her child. The story was messy. Cleveland admitted to sleeping with her, but claimed he was not the only man involved with Halpin at the time. What makes the story even darker is that Halpin was reportedly institutionalized against her will after the affair, and her child was sent to an orphanage. During his presidential campaign, opponents taunted him with chants of, "Ma, Ma, where's my pa?" After Cleveland's victory, his supporters shot back, "Gone to the White House. Ha, ha." It was a cruel reminder that women's reputations were often destroyed in these scandals, while men's careers survived. Cleveland's affair revealed the predatory behavior of powerful men and the vulnerable position of women who crossed their paths. As the 20th century dawned, secrecy became harder to maintain, but the scandals didn't stop. President Warren G. Harding, whose administration is already remembered as one of the most corrupt in history, lived a private life that was equally sordid. Harding carried on multiple affairs, including one with Nan Britton, a woman 30 years his junior, who later claimed he fathered her child. Their relationship was conducted in hotel rooms, apartments, and even, shockingly, in the White House itself. Britton's tell-all memoir after Harding, Steph painted a lurid picture of a president consumed by lust and reckless in his pursuit of pleasure. Harding's affair became symbolic of the excess, corruption, and moral decay of the Roaring Twenties, a reminder that the Oval Office has often been home not just to leadership, but to indulgence and betrayal. These stories, spanning the early history of the White House, remind us that love and lust, scandal and secrecy have always coexisted with power. The men who held the highest office in the land were still human, driven by the same desires, flaws, and weaknesses as anyone else, but with consequences that rippled across the nation. The White House may be painted white, but its history is stained with affairs that reveal the shadows of power. And this is only the beginning. As America moved into the modern era, the love affairs of presidents became more brazen, more public, and more dangerous. The story of twisted romance in the White House did not end in the 19th century. It only grew darker with time. The White House has always projected an image of dignity, tradition, and power. But behind those polished portraits and stately ceremonies, it was often a house of secrets, whispered passions, and forbidden relationships. If you thought the scandals of modern politics were shocking, the past of America's presidents tells an even darker, more tangled story. Affairs were not simply matters of lust or curiosity. They were reflections of power, control, and the precarious line between public duty and private desire. Take Warren G. Harding, for instance, a man whose presidency was already drowning in corruption scandals. His private life was just as chaotic. Harding maintained a long affair with Nan Britton, a woman 30 years his junior, who later claimed they conceived a child together. But this wasn't just a quiet romance hidden away. Britton detailed in her memoir how Harding would sneak her into the White House and conduct their trysts in a small closet adjoining the Oval Office. For years, critics dismissed her claims as fiction until DNA testing in 2015 confirmed her daughter's lineage. Harding, remembered in history books as one of the weakest presidents, left behind a legacy not just of political disgrace, but of an affair that proved too bold, too brazen, to remain hidden forever. Then there was John F. Kennedy, a man whose charm and charisma defined an era. To the public, Kennedy and Jackie were the picture of American royalty. But behind closed doors, the president's appetite for women became legendary. His alleged relationship with Marilyn Monroe has become one of the most infamous love stories in American history. Monroe's sultry performance of Happy Birthday in 1962 hinted at what insiders already knew. She wasn't just singing to the president, she was entangled with him. Rumors swirled that their affair posed a national security risk, given Monroe's own vulnerabilities and Kennedy's political enemies. The tragic ending of her life only deepened the mystery. Some argue she knew too much, others that she was simply discarded after being used. Whatever the truth, Kennedy's reckless pursuits revealed the dangerous intersection of private indulgence and public responsibility. And yet, Kennedy wasn't the only president whose personal life risked unraveling the dignity of the office. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, admired for his steady leadership during the Great Depression and World War II, was privately entangled in a decades-long romance with Lucy Mercer, his wife Eleanor's social secretary. Eleanor discovered the affair in 1918 when she stumbled upon love letters hidden in Franklin's luggage. Their marriage never fully recovered, though they remained political partners. What makes Roosevelt's story so striking is how his personal life mirrored the larger sacrifices of his public one. He depended on Lucy for emotional intimacy in ways Eleanor never could provide. Yet it was Eleanor who stood by his side as First Lady, championing human rights and equality while he governed a nation in crisis. Roosevelt's love affair wasn't just a private betrayal. It shaped the dynamics of one of America's most influential political partnerships. These weren't isolated stories. Throughout history, the personal passions of presidents collided with their political roles, sometimes with devastating consequences. Affairs became weapons for enemies to exploit, sources of blackmail, and stains on legacies carefully crafted for public consumption. They remind us that presidents were not untouchable figures of moral purity, but deeply flawed human beings, struggling with desires they could not always control. And so, the White House remained both a symbol of American ideals and a stage where human weakness played out in whispers and scandal. Behind its marble columns and ceremonial halls, history was not just being written, it was being seduced, betrayed, and reshaped by affairs that were too twisted to ignore. The deeper we look into the private lives of American presidents, the more we see that love, lust, and secrecy were as much a part of their legacy as policies and wars. If the White House could speak, it wouldn't just tell stories of triumph and leadership, it would whisper tales of betrayal, obsession, and the kind of intimacy that toppled reputations and rewrote history itself. Take Lyndon B. Johnson. Known for his larger-than-life personality and ruthless political instincts, Johnson's private life was equally excessive. Friends and staffers quietly acknowledged that Johnson kept mistresses throughout his marriage. He boasted about his conquests in crude terms, even installing a buzzer system in the Oval Office to alert him when his wife Lady Bird was nearby, so he could avoid being caught. To the world, Lady Bird was the picture of a loyal First Lady. But inside the White House, Johnson's affairs were an open secret reminders that even the most powerful man in the nation struggled with appetites that defied restraint. But perhaps no scandal rivals the one that defined an entire presidency: Bill Clinton's affair with Monica Lewinsky. What began as a relationship between a president and a young White House intern exploded into one of the most infamous political scandals in American history. Clinton's denials, his famous line, "I did not have sexual relations with that woman," became a national punchline, replayed endlessly on television. But behind the jokes was a crisis that nearly ended his presidency. The impeachment proceedings didn't just expose a personal failing. They revealed the extraordinary lengths to which power will go to cover its secrets. Clinton's legacy will always carry the shadow of that affair, proof that in the age of mass media, no indiscretion could remain hidden for long. Yet not all twisted affairs in the White House ended in public disgrace. Some were buried so deeply that only fragments survive in letters and gossip. Grover Cleveland, long before he became president, faced accusations of fathering a child out of wedlock. Political opponents chanted, "Ma, ma, where's my pa?" at rallies, only for Cleveland's supporters to reply, "Gone to the White House." Ha ha ha. The scandal didn't prevent his rise, but it left a permanent stain on his reputation. For Cleveland, the truth about his affair was less important than the image he projected to voters, and the American public proved willing to overlook the whispers when it suited them. And then there's Richard Nixon, a man remembered for paranoia, Watergate, and his dramatic fall from grace. While Nixon's marriage to Pat was never rocked by confirmed affairs, the rumors of his relationships with other women followed him throughout his career. Whether fact or speculation, the mere existence of such rumors demonstrates how entangled personal lives and political reputations had become by the 20th century. The private heart of the president was no longer immune from scrutiny. It was ammunition in the endless war for power. What unites all these stories is a truth Americans rarely want to admit. The men who shaped their country's destiny were just as vulnerable to desire and deception as anyone else. Affairs in the White House weren't only about romance or betrayal. They were about the power to take risks, to indulge, and to believe that the walls of the presidential mansion could contain even the most dangerous secrets. Sometimes those secrets stayed hidden. Other times they burst into the light, shaking the foundations of the presidency itself. In the end, the history of White House love affairs isn't just about sex or scandal. It's about how human weakness collides with the crushing weight of leadership. These stories force us to strip away the myths and see presidents not as distant heroes, but as flawed men who carried both the burdens of their office and the temptations of their hearts. And perhaps that is the most twisted truth of all. Behind the façade of power, the men who lived in the White House were, in the most intimate ways, no different from anyone else.